Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for July the 30th, 2021. Hope you're doing well on this day. So our text for today, we've got Mark chapter 12, Acts 17, sermon of Paul on Mars Hill and Areopagus. Then we got Jeremiah 26, Jeremiah's temple sermon. And then finally, we've got Judges 13. So we'll start with Mark again. How about that? So in Mark 12, this is kind of I guess this would be Tuesday of Holy Week, a day of teaching on the part of Jesus. And as he is doing so, he confronts the scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees in a number of discussions. But he begins chapter 12 with a parable that's very similar, of course, to a parable that we found in Isaiah chapter 5, where Isaiah proclaims judgment on the people. God does through Isaiah, I guess, by comparing Israel to this vineyard, and then they rent it out to these people who are to care for the vineyard, and he goes out on a journey, and then at harvest time, the vineyard owner sends a slave to the vine growers, and they produce in order to get some of the fruit. And they take him and beat him and send him away empty-handed. Again, there's another slave, and then another one they killed, and so with many others, some beating, some killing, and then he sends his beloved son. What I love about this passage is that, of course, that beloved son is representative of Jesus. The others are representative of the prophets. We're actually going to see a story in Jeremiah 26 today that's going to be illustrative of this, how all the prophets were persecuted and even killed, and now they're going to send the son. God's going to send the son to this fruitless nation, and they're going to reject him as well. And this is what they say in verse 7. This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So ultimately, what's the sin, according to this parable, that leads to the rejection of Jesus, but coveting and jealousy, which is perhaps what a lot of what we would say even today, leads to rejection of Jesus is coveting and jealousy. And then at the end of that parable, Jesus quotes once again from Psalm 118. Which would be a great psalm to preach on in our little series, Summer of Psalms. Then Jesus has various discussions with the scribes and the Pharisees and Sadducees, the famous rendering under Caesar passage that we've talked about before, discussion with the Sadducees who had rejected the resurrection, which is Sadducee, and then you have the statement that he makes about, of course, they're trying to trip him up by asking him, is there going to be marriage after the resurrection? And he says that we'll be like the angels in heaven, neither marrying or given in marriage. But then notice what the understanding, our understanding of the resurrection is based on. It's based on the scriptures and the power of God. Those two things are witnesses to the resurrection. And because he is, verse 26, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. God is God of the living, not the dead. Because he is that, so we will be living. And then finally, you have the question about what's the foremost commandment, and then the story of the widow's mite at the end, which of course illustrative of how God really has taught. You see this perhaps even more in Matthew, where this emphasis, and also in Luke, that God judges the heart as much as and the attitude as much as the action itself. So that's Mark 12. Let's move on to Acts 17. This, of course, details three major stories, really. You've got Paul at Thessalonica. Now, again, remember that he's over in Greece now. So he begins at Thessalonica. And I love what it says in verse 6, that the city authorities are shouting, "These men have upset the world." and they've come here also. May that be something that's said of us at New Prospect. We're upsetting the world because we're bringing forth the life-changing gospel of Jesus Christ. Then you have Paul at Berea, which of course the Bereans are known for the fact that they, verse 11, examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things are so. Presents a great model for us to follow whenever we hear any teaching, including the teaching that comes from the pulpit at New Prospect. Examine the scriptures for yourself to see if these things are so, because this is our authority, not men, but the word of God, right? And then finally, we have Paul's confrontation of the philosophers in Athens. And I've got a picture for you here, I think. So he goes to Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, and there it is there, where he is provoked in his heart by the city full of idols, and he speaks of the using the altar that had the inscription "to an unknown God." He says, "What you worship in ignorance, I proclaim to you. The God who made the heavens and the earth, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with human hands. He not served by human hands, although he needed anything, since he gives to all people life and breath in all things." So here's Paul. It's a great example, not changing the message, but changing what he says to fit the context, right? And addressing the people that he's talking to in ways they understand. Much like what our missionaries, what Arturo and Jordan are doing in Peru, right? Those are the folks who live in Mara do not have the access to written language, but they respond best to the stories, and so they communicate the gospel by storing, because that's the language that they understand in terms of the gospel message, even as Paul is adjusting the way he presents the gospel based on what the philosophers of Athens understood. So I think that's instructive for us as well. That's Acts 17. Moving on to Jeremiah 26. So in Jeremiah 26 through 29, we really have a section that narrates three different incidents in which Jeremiah is coming into conflict with the priests and the prophets and the civil authorities in Jerusalem because of his preaching. He begins with a temple sermon, which is very reminiscent of what we have in Jeremiah 7. In fact, it's a little bit briefer here. In Jeremiah 7, it's more of an extended sermon, but it's kind of summarized here in verses 4 through 6. And then they are going to try to kill him because of what he's saying. But then some of the people say to the priests and the prophets, don't sentence this man to death. And they compare him to Micah, who lived about 150, 200 years before Jeremiah, and said, well, Micah said similar things, and y'all didn't kill him. But Hezekiah listened to him and responded with repentance. But so don't kill him. And so they don't. But then there's this other guy, Uriah, the son of Shemaiah, and he says some of the same things Jeremiah is saying, and they're going to kill him. He flees to Egypt, and what happens to him? But he gets captured there in Egypt, brought back, and then King Jehoiakim has him slain with the sword and cast his dead body into the burial place of the common people. So here's an example of what Jesus was talking about in that parable of the vineyard, where Uriah is killed and Jeremiah is rejected. And as we'll see, he will also be imprisoned at some point as well. So Jeremiah 26. Then finally, we've got the beginning of the story of Samson. Now, in Judges, remember that we've gone through all the Judges cycles except for one. So we're down to the last one. We've had 5 of the 6 major cycles as they're this downward spiral towards Canaanization. And we're getting to this last one, which is Samson. And there's a question here. So what's going to happen? Could Israel somehow be redeemed? Could they start that spiral going back up, where they are getting closer and closer to God and away from Canaanization rather than becoming more and more like the Canaanites? Are they going to be holy? Are they going to be separate and distinct? Are they going to be what they were supposed to be, a kingdom of priests and a light to the nations? Or are they going to be the opposite? Are they going to be totally indistinguishable from the nations and become dark like the nations and become like the Canaanites? And Samson is going to answer that question definitively here. But it starts out, and you might be thinking, in reading chapter 13, that this perhaps could be the time when Israel goes back in the other direction under the leadership of this man Samson. Now, this is the tribe of Dan here, and if you remember from Judges 1, the Danites were the ones who didn't just live among the Canaanites. They didn't even live among the Canaanites because they couldn't even drive them out. They couldn't even live among them. So they end up just kind of wandering around. That'll become more significant when we get to chapter 17 in this book as well. So this is kind of just a camp. In fact, it's called Mahane Dan, which is literally the camp of Dan. So they're just kind of a nomadic tribe at this point. And so there's a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah. Now that phrase, "a certain man of," is going to be significant because we'll get to 1 Samuel, and we'll have that same phrase, and we'll also get to Luke 1, and we'll have that same phrase, and that will be significant. And I think when we were talking about Luke, I mentioned that. So that man, his name is Manoah, and his wife was barren. And again, this is kind of like one of those literary light bulbs or alarms should go off in your mind as you're reading through and you find a barren woman, because this is a clue in the Bible that something amazing is about to happen, that God is going to intervene to overcome this barrenness. And of course, it would recall for a Jewish reader going back to the patriarchs, specifically Sarah, that God was going to intervene to do something special on behalf of his people, to further salvation history, you could say. And so immediately upon reading this text, our anticipation is built up, right? We're thinking that that something amazing is going to happen, and maybe what's going to happen is Israel's going to go back to what they were supposed to be. Well, an angel appears to the woman and says that you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive. And so this is going to be a conception that is that's enabled by God himself. That had to be something that would, of course, raise the expectations of the reader, of the ancient Jewish reader as well. And what will happen for this person? He will be one who will not drink strong drink or wine or anything unclean, and no razor shall come upon his head. In other words, he is to be a Nazarite. And for a Nazarite, those are the three characteristics: not coming into contact with anything grapish, especially wine, not cutting your hair, so you cut it once and then you don't cut it again. And then finally, thirdly, not touching anything or consuming anything that is dead. And so what do we have here? We have Samson, who's now going to be born. Let's see, verse 24 is when he's born. By the way, Samson, the own ending, we talked about this with Eglon, is a diminutive. It's coming from Shemesh, which Shemesh in the Hebrew means son. You add the own ending to it, you get Shimshon, which means sunny. Sunny is Samson's name. Kind of a pet name for a kid, I guess you could say, is the own ending, diminutive, like Dan or Danny, that kind of thing. And so here's Samson. And again, we think at this point, here we have Samson, who is blessed by God, it says in the text. He is supposed to be separate from all, to show holiness, and he is the product of a barren woman. If at any point in the book of Judges, something good is going to happen. It's going to be with Samson, right? And of course, as you read through the story of Samson, keep this in mind as well, that Samson is going to become a parable for all of Israel. So Samson is one who has a miraculous birth, just like Israel does, is supposed to be holy, just like Israel was, and is blessed by God with great strength, just like Israel was. And yet we'll see what happens to Israel and to Samson during his reign as a judge. So hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, July 30th, 2021. Looking forward to looking what happens in the rest of the story of Samson.